Good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 24th Annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. So before turning to tonight's lecture, I have a few housekeeping duties that I need to take care of. First, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for both our virtual and in-person audience. You'll see instructions in the QR code up here, I believe. There it is. And if you have any questions about the captioning, please visit the AV team up in the booth upstairs or send a message in chat if you're watching online. Second, while we have your attention, we want to highlight some exciting events coming up in the GSD's public programming series. Here are the next two. I believe the slide will change. So tomorrow and Saturday, April 4th and 5th, the GSD will host Acts of Scaling, the 2025 edition of Cambridge Talks, an annual conference organized by students of the PhD program in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning at the GSD. Then, on Tuesday, April 8th, the architect Kengo Kuma will deliver the John Haydock Soundings Lecture entitled Return to Nature. Please visit the GSD website to learn more, RSVP, live stream these events, and many, many more events that are free and open to all. All right, I've got the housekeeping out of the way. Now to turn to tonight's lecture. So my job here is to tell you all who is this John T. Dunlop fellow that this lecture is named after. First of all, this is an opportunity for the Joint Center to host a distinguished housing leader to address the Harvard community, as well as the broader world of housers watching here both in person and online. But there's really a chance for us to remember John Dunlop, who was instrumental for many years in supporting the center and ensuring our long-term success. He was a professor of economics for more than a half a century. He started in the 1930s and extended into his emeritus into the early part of this century. He was a leader within the university. He was department chair of the economics department, FAS dean, university professor. And then outside the university, he was secretary of labor under President Ford, an advisor to presidents from the Great Depression into the 21st century, and a leader in mediation between industry and labor. But importantly for us, he was also instrumental in establishing our policy advisory board that builds a bridge between academia and practice and provides the center with financial stability that allow us to endure for now into our 7th decade. So we're grateful for all that Professor Dunlop did to ensure that as a center, we can have such long-standing place at the university and pursuing our mission to improve equitable access to decent, affordable homes in thriving communities and to spark conversations for how do we address these challenges. So tonight, we hope the lecture will help fulfill that goal of sparking new ideas to address the need for decent, affordable homes for all. But now, it's my pleasure to introduce pass the baton to Sarah Whiting, our dean, the Joseph Louis Sert Professor of Architecture. We're grateful to Sarah for her guidance, for her support, and her friendship. So Sarah, it's really great to have a chance to welcome you and thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Super. Hello, and welcome to all of you attending in person or virtually. As Chris noted, I'm the dean. In addition to tonight's talk, Reimagining Social Housing, serving as this year's John T. Dunlop Lecture, sponsored by Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, it's also our GSD Open House Lecture. We're excited to have all of you here with us, joining in person or virtually, whether you're an admitted student, an enrolled student, faculty member, a housing aficionado, neither, or both, or all. I just want to explain the structure. So we will have tonight's lecture by our distinguished visitor, and then our fantastic assistant professor of practice and partner at French 2D, Jenny French, who coordinates the Core 4 housing studio here in the Department of Architecture, will have an interview or a conversation with Peter before we open it up to the floor for questions and answers. So I'm going to keep my introduction short because there's a lot on the table. So Peter Barber is the founder of the eponymous, a word I really like, the eponymous firm Peter Barber Architects, which is based in London and recognized for its innovative and exquisite approaches to social housing and urban planning. The firm has received numerous awards, as has Barber himself. I trust that you have all done your homework and have read about Peter on the web, and so I won't waste time with details. I just want to highlight one of these awards. In 2023, Peter received the Soane Medal, which recognizes, quote, those who have enriched the public understanding of architecture, a characterization that's key for why he's such an ideal and timely speaker here at the GSD. So the crisis of housing is sadly one that, along with the climate crisis, unites our globe. While politics and policy may differ from city to city, let alone country to country, the very same questions are being faced in every context. How can we build affordable, durable, and extraordinary housing for all? And in addressing the housing crisis, how can we address what I would call our public crisis? That is, the crisis that surrounds us, which is that of the constant chipping away of our civic and cultural realms, those critical, formative spaces that unite us all in our common humanity. Now, I've been known to criticize students who pile on quote after quote, so I ask for forgiveness right now, because I'm going to do just that. I'll end with a series of quotes that are a little bit like a matryoshka, which is a nesting doll set. So the first doll, the British writer, curator, and urbanist Phineas Harper, who opens to the second doll, Peter Barber. This is Harper quoting Barber, so that's where it gets complicated. He says, a shadowy street with a little kick, tapering and narrowing suddenly before opening through an archway into the corner of a sunny square. Nice. And now let me turn to Harper commenting on that quote. Harper writes, most architects do not write like this. Most architects do not wear leather, take their sons to WWE wrestling matches, personally hammer out jazz piano at their office summer party, or plaster the door of their 90s flat share with gold leaf. Most architects are not Peter Barber. So I just can't top that image. So I'm going to let Peter come here and demonstrate that enticing description for all of us. Thank you, Peter Barber, for being here.
Wow. What a lovely introduction. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Harvard and David and all the people who've been involved here in inviting us. I'm here with my partner, Daisy, to come and give this talk. It's lovely to be back in Boston. I was here 40 years ago. It's great to be back in Boston, and actually for the first time in Cambridge now. So, and we had a lovely day walking through the town, down Massachusetts Avenue to the river and across. Yeah, it's been a lovely stay so far. I'm going to talk for about an hour. I'm going to begin with a little introduction about our office and about me. We do mostly social housing, but we do a mixture of stuff. It's all urban housing, almost always urban housing. Here's one which is one of the models that we have for social housing in our country is that we build social housing, but we build private housing mixed in with it, which helps to fund the work. This is pure social housing and what can happen when people are given a little front garden and some dignity. This is a homeless shelter, so it's another sort of string to our bow. And the best of the London boroughs still take seriously their responsibility to the weakest and most needy people in our society. This is for sale housing, so we do apartment buildings like this, which sort of complement the social work that we do also. This is an educational project in South London, which is for long-term homeless people to try and find their feet. This is a private one-off house, and more social housing. But I want to kick off and we're a tiny practice. We're 5 or 6 people. We box well above our weight, and we seem to be getting a lot of attention with the kinds of projects that I've just shown you. What I'm going to do now I'm going to come on and show you some more detail on those projects and talk about some of the theoretical work that we do. I also teach, and it's great to be within a sort of academic setting because I view that as a really important part of cultivation of ideas and progression of new ideas. But before I get into the projects themselves, I want to talk a little bit about the environment in which we're working and to give you some quotes and some images which help to flesh out the sort of ideological position of our practice, the things that give us a kind of moral and ethical guide when we're trying to design our projects. But the context in which we're working is a very, very difficult one. London, one of the richest cities the world has ever seen, has 170,000 homeless people and 10,000 street dwellers. This is a consequence, in my view, of the succession of very bad decisions by successive governments of both complexions, which have led to the housing crisis which we are experiencing. This is a march that we went on in London 4 or 5 years ago. This is a not unfamiliar site for us in London, and it is the site of social housing, hard-won social housing built by the post-war generation. They were building 150,000 homes a year in the aftermath of the Second World War when our country was broke. And to the extent that by 1975, nearly half the population enjoyed the benefit of living inexpensively in social housing. What an incredible achievement by that generation. But it's an achievement that's been demolished and pulled apart in the last 50 years, commencing with Margaret Thatcher's Housing Act of 1977. And this is a social housing project in North London. And it's a photograph that's quite nicely captioned by a quote from the then Prime Minister, David Cameron. He said this: "Post-war estates across the country are ripe for redevelopment. We will sweep away the planning blockages and take new steps to reduce political and reputational risk for the project's key decision makers and investors. I believe that together we can tear down anything that stands in our way." And tear it down they have. So, as I say, there are now 170,000 homeless people in our city. And I think that, in broad terms, the problem has arisen as a consequence of the commodification of housing. At one time in our country, housing was considered to be basic infrastructure, a right that people had. It is now seen as investment vehicle, at the sort of macro level of pension funds sweeping in and sweeping whole neighborhoods away and building this sort of stuff. But also for individuals simply trying to get their feet on the housing ladder, and so it's an abandoning of housing to the sort of commercial product, to the commodification product. In London, these are sort of turnkey apartment buildings that are being built mostly for overseas investors. There are 20,000 empty homes which have never really been opened up or lived in, and they're just being held by investors as investment vehicles. And the consequence is this is a subway, a couple of 100 yards away from Buckingham Palace, and it's a very common sight for people who live in our city. This is somebody's bedroom. And this is somebody else's bedroom. This is a £150 million apartment in Kensington. So we are looking at a situation which is, I think, created by ideology, which is created by simply by the inequality in our society, and to that extent, it is resolvable. I feel sort of personally quite kind of uncomfortable with what is going on because we live in a democracy. We have the ballot box, we have direct action, and we ought to be able to change things. And this has been the situation that's been going on for many years now. In my view, 3 things could be done to remedy the situation. The first would be to start a very large social housing program of the scale that, as I say, they were able to manage after the Second World War, when incidentally they were building a national health service at the same time. We need to probably institute, in the short term at least, while the new housing is being built, public sector rent controls, private sector rent controls, and we need to end the right to buy. We have a peculiar situation where social tenants can buy their flat. On the face of it, a nice idea, but it effectively removes from public ownership very useful public housing. Another issue for us in our country is the distribution of resources across the country. They're huge, and it may be the same here, I don't know, perhaps come out in conversation. Huge areas of our country have become depopulated as a consequence of the loss of industry, and so there are now 500,000 empty homes in the UK. Whole neighbourhoods which have been abandoned. And I think I would like to see interventionist government moving in and encouraging industries back into these areas, away from the southeast, where there's a very overheated housing situation, and into these areas where there are huge amounts of empty buildings. So I want to give you the first of a series of quotes and images which help to give you a sense of where we're coming from when we work with our projects. And this is a photograph of the city of Naples, and it's the idea of an architecture and of a city which is nothing until it has life breathed into it by the activity of its occupants, the colour and the activity which is created by a city and architecture which is permeable, which invites occupation. And the quote here is one from the great Walter Benjamin, who wrote a book called One-Way Street in the 1920s. And in each of the chapters of that book, he describes a city, a European city. And his description of Naples really teases out this idea of the relationship between people and architecture, between culture and buildings. So he says this: The passion for improvisation demands that space and opportunity be at any price preserved. Buildings are used as a popular stage. They're all divided into innumerable simultaneously animated theatres. Balcony, courtyard, window, gateway, staircase, roof are at the same time stages and boxes. So he's talking about the sort of theatricality of the city, and a city erupting into life, and architecture erupting into life as it kind of gets taken over by people. He says, as porous as the stone is the architecture. Buildings and action interpenetrate in the courtyards. Arcades and stairways. In everything they preserve the scope to become a theatre of new unforeseen constellations. The stamp of the definitive is avoided. No situation appears intended forever. And so when we're confronted as a practice with a sheet of white paper, a site, a brief, we're always trying to sort of people our buildings in our minds with the people who will ultimately be occupying them, and trying to imagine what kind of activity and what kind of world will emerge in the buildings after they've been completed. All of our work really uses the idea of the street. So although we're building housing, in a city like London, and for all I know, this city as well, 70% of all of the buildings in London are houses or housing. It's what the city is made of. It's what surrounds our squares. It's what compresses space into streets. And creates this sort of sense of congestion and excitement that we all, I think, all enjoy in the city. The street, in my view, in all situations, is the basic building block of the city. There's been lots of experiments with other forms of urbanism, which, in my view, are, for the most part, unsuccessful. And I think it's just worth thinking about the street, the way that, as I say, it compresses social activity into a narrow space. It brings people from all sorts of different backgrounds into a single space. Rich people, poor people, people from different social groups, different cultural groups, racial groups. And to that extent, it performs a really powerful function in the notion of a society which is well integrated. A space like this feels safe. It's really well overlooked. Jane Jacobs, Eyes on the Street. And it's a space which has life 24 hours a day because it has shops, it has people living over those shops, it has offices, it has a pub on the corner. So it's a comfortable space to be in. It's also a really easy way to navigate a city. A well-integrated set of streets tends to create easy to understand layouts and connections between neighbourhoods. This is a slide which reminds me just to talk a little bit about the idea of public space. I love the idea of public space belonging to everybody and belonging to nobody. This is the clearing, the opening up of the city at the edge of the city of Marrakesh, where for the last 1,000 years, in the cool of the evening, the little alleyways of the city discharge into this space, and night after night, the most fantastic sort of theatrical event, kind of unplanned theatrical event takes place as little stages are pulled out into the square, as little temporary groups of people make rings around snake charmers and storytellers and musicians. And it's a highly ephemeral, informal form of architecture. And it's a space which is not in the main made by monuments. It's a space, it's a clearing in the city, and this fantastic sort of movement of people swirling around and relating to each other in the most kind of relaxed way. This reading of public space, this particular public space, is reinforced by its name, which is Jama al-Fana. And one of the translations of Jama al-Fana is a mosque of nothing. And I love the idea of public space being a kind of mosque of nothing, space where people can kind of be themselves within certain systems of etiquette, but nevertheless where a kind of unplanned encounters and kind of theatricality in the way that Walter Benjamin talks about plays out in this space. And behind the photographer in this picture, it is the counterpoint to this space in all its kind of changing ephemerality, is the ancient mosque of Marrakesh, quite the antithesis, with its 2-meter thick walls, its sort of unchanging ideology, its unchanging presence, and as I say, its counterpoint in this fantastic theatrical and ephemeral event that unfolds every night. So I want to say a little bit about our office, and here we are in King's Cross, and it is a lovely little place to work, and this is another little quote from another of my heroes, Lena Bobardi. And she says this: "The city is a public space, a great exhibition offering all kinds of subtle readings, and anyone who has a shop window or a display of any kind should showcase of this kind has to assume a moral responsibility which requires that their window display might help to shape the taste of the city dwellers, to help to shape the face of the city and to reveal something of its essence." And it's lovely to have a shop front. Those are our models in the window, and we have tourists coming up, we have homeless people looking in, we have all manner of people coming by and knocking on the door, and to have that kind of front addressing the city and welcoming people into this space. So we're a very analog office. We're quite old-fashioned. We don't use the computer in the early days, in the early stages of the design process. We make physical models, and we make them with scalpels. We don't make them on the machine. They're part of the design process. And but we also have some fun, and that's our roof terrace. And we're a tiny office, as I say, 6 or 7 people. And we've been described as less of an architecture office and more of a dinner party. And if we can get round on a Friday night for some beers in a pub or in a restaurant, then we do that. And so we achieve a great deal with a very small team, tightly knit team. As I say, we're very analog. We work with sketches. We don't use the computer for those sketches. We just overlay sheets of yellow paper, and the iterative process kind of unfolds as the scheme unfolds. And it's quite fun sometimes looking back through the sheets of paper and seeing the schemes develop through those sheets of paper. So those are design drawings. They're not really presentation drawings, but they're useful for presentation to share ideas with one another. Our models at the largest scale, the 1 to 500, are made out of foam, so we can start to see the massing of the city, the width of streets, the size of courtyards and routes through the project. We then move in a little closer and make cardboard models which help us to think about the fenestration. And we go in closer again so that we can get into the interiors with sort of foam core models. That model's probably that size. So look, this is the first of the detailed sort of projects that I want to take you through. This is a project called Donnybrook Quarter. Some of you may know it. It was the winner of a competition sort of 20 years ago. And it was a scheme which is designed around 2 streets which open out into a public square. You can see them there. Yeah, there's the square. There's 2 streets that run through. So it's connected very strongly with its surroundings in terms of spatially. And we won this competition because we said this scheme, I think people were expecting a fence around the project and an apartment building sitting in the middle. Whereas we integrated it into the spatial movement system of the city. And we said this scheme is a celebration of the public social life of the street. And so that's how it unfolds. So these are all peculiar little double height stacked maisonettes. There's a ground floor unit here with a front door, and there's a gate there which leads up to a first floor terrace and a maisonette on top. So every home has its own front door along the street, and every home has its own outside space in the form of a little courtyard or a little back garden like that. And when we came up with the idea, people were saying, well, you need front gardens. We need to be able to protect people from, well, they talk about defensible space. It was the big word around in the 90s. And I'm thinking, defense against who? You know, my neighbors? Do I really need to defend myself? This is my little house. And what can start to happen if you don't have a front garden and people start to take control of the space at the front of their homes? The type which I'm describing, one unit above the other, with no interior circulation, the circulation is all in the street, is a historical type. It's called a cottage flat, and here's an Edwardian example. That door leads into that unit, that door leads up to that unit. And although they're flats, you know, quite often we think of the modernist block as being a block of flats sitting in the middle of a big piece of space. Our flats still make the street. The street is still really important to us. The other feature of Donnybrook, as I said, is the roof terrace. And again, people say, well, roof terrace, isn't that going to cause noise, you know, nuisance between neighbours? And so I took our client down here to a project called Pullens Building in South London, where there are these amazing roof terraces, a Victorian block, which incidentally was going to be knocked down as substandard housing, but thankfully was saved by its residents. And again, sort of precedent is a really important part for me. If I can see where somebody's done something before, I grow in confidence with an idea. And so we felt emboldened to push ahead with this project. That looks like a CGI, doesn't it? Like a computer image. That's actually a photograph taken from a local tower block. And you can see these little courtyards in the middle of the block. You can see the intersection of 2 streets. And again, a very intimate relationship between the street and the interior, things pushing out over the street, balconies and oriel windows. And there's lots of repetition in the project, but there's a sort of picturesque component to this, so that where there's a prominent corner, we'll make a bit more effort with the sort of nice curving corner to sort of capture a view or a view through into the square here. The key to the density at Donnybrook, by the way, is that, I don't know if it's the same here, but in England, when you have 2 terraces of houses back to back, they have to have at least 20 yards between them for privacy between, you know, people looking that way and a housing block looking that way. The backs of the buildings need to be very far apart. Well, we've brought that down to, let's go back to that, we've brought that down to 8 metres, so that's, you know, from me to that column there. And so there are no principal windows looking backwards across this space. These upper units all look sideways into their private courtyard, and the back-to-back overlooking distance is not an issue here because there's a wall down the middle. So we were able to bring the buildings much closer together than the planning laws in the UK would usually allow. And so we've got quite a lot of homes there by pushing them down and really compacting the spaces between the homes, the width of the street and these little courtyards into not very much. Lovely to go back and find these courtyards being used in this way, in a way that I think Walter Benjamin would have approved on. Again, kind of life being breathed into the buildings by their occupants. Doesn't always happen, you know, you can't predict it, but you kind of hope that by creating the conditions where people can do this, that they might. So this is a series of photographs of the front doors of the project, and we made a mistake. You don't want to have a window in a front door because nobody wants to be seen answering the front door, do they? That's why you have these little things. So, but sometimes mistakes kind of work in your favour, and every time I go back down there, there is a new photograph in each window, and to see people taking control of their environment. And you know, every single window has a picture in it, and so it's a lovely thing that's happened, and that's the architect's house. So look, this is more conventional terraced housing. It's another social housing project. I think like 5,000 people applied for these 20 homes. That's how much trouble we're in at the moment. I've been on a trip to India and got very excited about this sort of decorative brickwork called Jali, perforated brickwork walls. But I wanted to make something of the entrance into these buildings. It seems to me that kind of modernism doesn't always make the best of celebrating these moments. So each of these houses has a lovely arched entrance and, as I say, a decorative wall. Each one of those is a 3-bedroom townhouse. So this is the next of the projects. We're now in the East End of London, and we were asked to look at this site here. This is social housing, which is very overcrowded. They're 2-bedroom homes, and they have extended families. Many of them have extended families living in them, generational housing. People are very, very overcrowded. So our client said, could we put 2 or 3 new homes on the site of these storage units? And it's a pretty depressing scene, really, but, you know, as an architect, you have to find a little glimmer of hope, don't you? And I was really struck by how people had taken control of the space outside their back doors to create these little gardens. Our site was kind of opposite over here. And so there are those gardens, those wooden fences, that rather kind of informal kind of vibe. And we decided to try and push our buildings right back against the edge in timber, but then to create a space between our new residents and the existing residents, and that this could become a space that would be shared by the existing homeowner, the occupants and the new occupants. And rather than 2 or 3 homes, by adopting this rather unusual kind of approach, we were able to get 8 or 9 homes. They don't have back gardens, they simply have these roof terraces. So each one of those is a house. That's a 7-bedroom house, 5s and 4s. And each one of them has a roof terrace and a little front garden, but they also then have the shared use of this garden. And how extraordinary it is to go from a sketch like that to a couple of years later, a scene like this. So these are timber shingles, which for us is unusual and actually impossible at the moment because the London government has outlawed the use of timber. Strange for you to hear that in a city that's to a significant extent made out of timber. But we had a big fire in London, which the politicians' knee-jerk reaction has said no more timber in construction. So at a time when the rest of Europe is increasingly using timber to build 8, 9, 10-story apartment buildings because it's such a brilliant material from an ecological perspective, we are not allowed to do so. But this was before that new rule came in. It's lovely again to go back and see people kind of really moving in and enjoying these courtyards and terraces that we've created for them. We have a thing in the UK, so lots of these are reworkings of pre-modern house types. And this is another reworking of a pre-modern house. So we have a thing, and I don't know if you have it here, called back-to-back housing. And that's housing where you have a terrace of houses there and a terrace of houses there, facing onto a street, but rather than having back gardens, they just really literally pushed back, right back, back to back. So people only really have an outlook at the front, and this is a traditional street like that, and what that means is that people aren't sitting in their back gardens kind of in isolation, they're sharing the space of the street between them, and investing all of their efforts into that space, and so you get this beautiful scene kind of emerging in housing of that type. We were given the job of doing a little housing scheme, again in the East End of London. Again, it's a social housing scheme, but it's a scheme for older people, I think people over 70. And I was really struck by the statistics amongst older people of loneliness and the extraordinary statistics about people just not seeing other people for weeks on end. I haven't got them in my head, but it's a very distressing and sad kind of situation. People in that age group, perhaps their kids have left home, perhaps they've stopped working, perhaps their partner has passed away. And so it seemed to me that, that the image I've just shown you of people sharing a space in the middle of a project could be a really good model for people of this age group. So we created this little alleyway, and there it is. And so there is no back garden. People will just come out, and this photograph was taken days after people had moved in, and they started to sort of take control of this space. And if you went down there on a summer's day, that all the people would be sitting out there, as if, chatting to one another. And one of the things they said was that, so these people in their 70s, they said, well, we were moved out of terraced housing, the traditional terraced housing of the East End in the 1960s, when they bulldozed it all because it was considered to be slum. We were moved into tower blocks, which we've been living in for all of our lives. And so being moved back here is like a bit of a homecoming. It's the world that we grew up in. It's the world that where we knew our neighbours and stuff like that. So it was quite heartwarming to hear that and to see, people very easily kind of slipping back into that way of being. And there's me having a cup of tea with Paula. So this is another back-to-back project. I'll tell you, so I was doing a lecture, before we built these projects, I was doing a lecture at the RIBA in London, the big institute in London, and I was talking about the idea of reintroducing back-to-back housing. And it's a type was basically discredited in the early part of the last century as slum housing, I said, and almost all of it has been demolished. And I was doing this lecture, I said, well, we're really interested in the idea of, it's a really interesting model for doing quite high density, not wasting space with back gardens. And somebody stood up at the end and said, well, I grew up in back-to-back housing, and it was the worst time of my life. It was a slum, it was hideous, it was awful, slightly awkward moment. And but then thankfully somebody else stood up and said, well, I grew up in back-to-back housing, and it was the happiest time of my life. We knew our neighbours, it was, and it was a disaster when we got moved out. And I think the lesson there is that people will tell you what they think housing should be or is. And I think it's really important that there are so many different sorts of people. It sounds kind of trite, but people will always try and tell you, well, I think housing should be this. And I think housing should be all sorts of different things to all sorts of people. One person's kind of hellish situation is another person's heaven. And so, me personally, I quite like the idea, you saw me sitting on my front doorstep, I quite like the idea of living that way. And so if that's your kind of thing, this is your kind of project. So it's in a 1960s housing estate. There are some older buildings here, but that's a row of houses which faces out onto the street, and right back on that is a row of houses which faces into a courtyard. So they truly are back to back. So there's the courtyard there, there's a house there, and there's another house there. You get into that house there, and you get into that house from the courtyard. These ones are 4 stories, so they're kitchen, bedroom, and then a living room on the top floor. And so, as I say, most of the back-to-back housing has been demolished, but there's a small number in Birmingham, in the Midlands, and they've been saved by a kind of a trust that we call the National Trust. And I thought I'd better go and visit this if this were what we're proposing, and so I did, and I thought it was just really beautiful, actually. That's the courtyard in a sort of traditional back-to-back housing. I was shown around by some people who are employed as volunteers, but who had grown up in back-to-back housing, and they spoke really positively about the world that they inhabited. I mean, the sanitation was awful, the maintenance was awful, but the kind of social logic of this kind of housing, I think, is persuasive. And so I came back kind of emboldened to give it a go. There's the plan. And again, they built it. So this is built by a local authority. It's council housing funded by taxation. It's what's possible if the will is there. We can be doing this. So as I say, kitchen, bedroom, living room up on the top floor. And again, so it's not a form of housing that suit everybody. You've got to have good knees. There's lots of climbing of staircases, and you've got to be quite gregarious. And so you'll see as the slides progress. There's a kitchen looking out onto the street. There's the living room at the top of the house. So if you're feeling friendly, you can sit in your kitchen. If you want to be on your own, you can be up on the top floor in your living room. But what started to happen is just the most marvelous thing. I've always been a great admirer of the stoop that you have in this country, and it's a tough thing to do because these days you have to have level access in our country into your home because of people with mobility issues. But and so I've always been trying to think about how we might try and rekindle that idea and reuse that idea of the interior of a house spilling out onto the edge of the pavement and the resultant kind of relationships that can emerge. So these arches, that's what these arches are really about. And it hasn't happened on every house, but a significant number have started to do this. And it's lovely to see. So the next project is, we get some bad sites, okay? This is the worst one. It's the North Circular Road, which is a 4, or is it 6-lane motorway, which runs around London. The people who are selling it was the Greater London, it was the Transport for London. They had a plan to widen this motorway into this space, and it never happened. So this site lay empty for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, and our client bought it. And it's a very tricky site because the thundering noise of traffic along here. It's a very thin site. That's how thin it is, and it kind of gets really thin there. So the site boundary sort of does that. But we came up with the idea of a building which would create a wall, a barrier against the main road. This building is most of it is 1 room thick. So nobody's relying on a window opening out over the main road. They can all open a window into this little mews, which is the key to the whole project. So these are like tenement buildings. So each one leads into, I don't know, 4 or 5 stories of flats stacked on one another. These are more houses on this side of the road, and the whole building kind of rises up at either end to create a sort of gateway and entrance into the mews. That's a drawing I did very early on in the project. And they built it. As I say, it's always it's kind of, it can be quite a straight line. It's painful, but it can be quite a straight line between that sketch done on day 1 and the realization of the project. And it was this is a mixture of social and private housing. It's 50-50, and it's done by a private developer. So he used the profit that he was making, or some of the profit he was making from the private housing to fund social housing. And the social housing bit of the project is run by a housing association who are one of the agencies that look after social housing. So it's an extraordinary story, really. It's a very heroic building from the site facing outwards onto the motorway, kind of robust, quite kind of muscular. But then when you get round into the mews, it has a much more sort of domestic feel to it, and it's softened by the sort of stepping ziggurat section of the building down into the mews. These photographs are taken quite soon after it's completed. It's slowly being sort of greened and starting to look more lived in, and really sort of intimate, narrow muses, which kind of reminiscent of the sort of thing you get in kind of medieval Italy and so on. And what we're finding already is that people are starting to use this space, kicking footballs around, playing badminton, kids running around, having a lovely time, front doors being left open. And it's playing its part, the space itself is playing its part in enabling a community to emerge. Developers, architects will often make the claim that they can build a community. I don't believe that's possible. I think you create the conditions in which a community can emerge, and I think it's really up to the people who live in a place. But we as architects can create a situation where that's more likely to happen. And that's what we're finding here. So people say, well, surely those flats that are facing out onto the main road, they must be, unlivable. That's simply not true. So these are treble glazed windows. None of them require mechanical ventilation because they're all facing out this way behind the photographer into the mews and can open windows. And in fact, the guy who lives here is a harpsichordist. So if that was any kind of proof that the strategy works, I think that's is a good one. So I've talked a lot about the street and how front doors along a street can play their part in kind of helping to set up a series of relationships between neighbours. This is a bigger building. It's an apartment block, but still we're taking a lot of trouble with how the building meets the street. Again, if you think of the sort of modernist block, it was set out with space around it. Our apartment block pushes up to the edge of the street, and to that extent, it's a bit like we call our traditional sort of apartment buildings, Victorian apartment buildings, did this very thing. So that's a gate into a ground and first floor maisonette, as are all of those along there. One of these leads into a core, which delivers people up into the apartment building above. And again, rather than balconies, people have got these roof terraces, which really form part of the architecture. The traditional Victorian block is called a mansion block, but I suppose you could call it tenement housing as well. But at the back of this building, there are some more little houses. We managed to sort of weave a few more in, with a courtyard at the rear. That's the back of the main building and a series of little courtyard houses. Again, this mixes social and private housing. All of the buildings I'm showing, there's a certain amount of elaboration in the architecture, but we were able to make these projects stack up financially because they're really, really efficient in terms of common area circulation. This one has a bit. But most of the housing, the terrace housing I've shown you, if you do an apartment building, 25% of all of the space that you're building is wasted space. It's corridors, it's lifts that need to be maintained, it's staircases, whereby with Donnybrook and projects like that, the front doors are along the street itself is the circulation of the building. And so there's a real benefit in terms of efficiencies for the developer, but also clearly a benefit in terms of the likelihood of people meeting in a street and being sort of happily being able to kind of meet one another than in a lift I think is unarguable. As buildings get bigger, they often get simpler, and people kind of, well, I'm just going to throw a grid over this and simplify it. So as our buildings get bigger, we really try to hold on to the idea that complexity and visual interest is part of the success of the project. And so this is one of the corners of that project. And again, I mean, to some extent, that's a wide-angle lens doing that to those balconies, but they are quite... They are quite long, actually. The secret is that upstand is actually a beam. And again, lovely to go back and find out. I mean, particularly during the pandemic, people started to really invest in this space at the back there and in their courtyards. And as I say, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you go back and it's a tremendous disappointment, but other times, things work out really well. This is a homeless project, and again, we're in North London now. One of the London boroughs is called the London Borough of Camden, and Camden famously produced some incredible social housing in the 1960s and 70s. Their housing department was closed down by Margaret Thatcher as part of those housing acts. But Camden still maintains and retains a powerful element of a sense of social responsibility. And so they have a whole series of homeless shelters. And this is one of them. And it hadn't had much done to it since Victorian times, so it's really run down. But I felt that the existing building had really nice qualities to it. It was a building, this is the street facade, which had a certain fondness, local people had a certain fondness for it. Camden were happy for us to knock it down and build a new building. I said we'd like to keep it. But so that's what we've just been looking at. But one was very struck by the very, very deep site and the possibilities presented by this space at the rear. And so we encourage them to keep that building, but think about this part of it's single story, so not very efficient. Think about another way of doing the back. Most homeless hostels have spaces like this in them, dark, dingy, no daylight corridors. It's enough to do anybody's head in. Most of the people who live in these places have had very troubling and difficult backgrounds. They've been kicked out of their social housing, or they've been kicked out by their folks, or they haven't been able to pay their rent, and so have had to leave their private housing. Many of them have accumulated sort of real problems, health problems, substance abuse problems, alcohol problems on the way. Many people in these sorts of places, for no fault of their own, and have mental health difficulties which are not being looked after by the health system. And so a space like that, where you've got to walk through a corridor like that to get to your room, would be enough for any of us. But for people, and there'd be a turn there and another turn, so I just wondered, in working in this section, I've been working in it for decades, whether a space like this might be a better way to get to your front door. And this is an example in Holland, actually, but we have them in the UK called almshouses, ALMS. And typically a local parish would set up a series of almshouses, very minute, miniature houses, for the elderly or disadvantaged people in their parish. And so I wondered about that, and there's the existing building, and in the place of the building that ran through the back of the site, we pushed the buildings to the perimeter and created a garden. And also kind of reception areas in these new hostels are much more open and welcoming. Typically, you walked into a hostel up until 20 years ago, you walked through a little door, there would be a window, it'd be very Dickensian, little window like that. What do you want? I need somewhere to stay. All right, come in then. Whereas in this project, that's a reception desk there. And that point of arrival was often a point of where things would kick off, get really nasty. And staff were very anxious in these places because of that. So there's a huge transformation. So this was the hostel as reconvened. So that used to be a corridor there, and there used to be a little window. So we've opened it all up, and if things are getting stressful, come and sit down over here on the sofa, and we could talk it through. It's not just heads on beds. There are programs being run in these places. So this is a little counselling space. There is attempts to help people to understand about nutrition, and to get into training and to look after themselves. And there are training kitchens to help people to learn how to escape from the cycle of hostel living, which can really entrap people. So here are our little cottages around a garden. And so we went to Camden, and we presented this as an idea to them. And I thought they'd laugh at us. That each person, rather than a bedroom or a dormitory, that each person might have their own front door and a little miniature house, and that it might be arranged around a garden, and the garden might actually be part of the therapeutic treatment and help given to the people who lived there. And they thought it was a lovely idea, Camden, and they weren't at all fazed by the fact that nothing had been done like this for since kind of medieval times. Anyway, I read this to them anyway, and I think it was part of what helped. I think the drawing kind of helped, but we imagined a group of residents, and this wasn't part of the brief, by the way. There was no garden mentioned in any brief. They just wanted a hostel with some slightly better bathrooms. We said this: we imagined a group of residents working with a gardener to create and maintain an intensely planted and beautiful garden with an apple tree or two, potatoes, green veg, soft fruit, herbs, a greenhouse, a potting shed, and a sunny spot to sit and meet. We think there ought to be a little room or shed in the garden for private chats. That's that shed over there. And one-to-one chats and counselling. Conceived as the social heart of the hostel, the garden creates a homely, domestic atmosphere. It gives participating residents an interest and an outlet for their energy, helping to foster a sense of belonging, self-worth, and empowerment. And that's it on day one. The gardening project has begun. But so each person gets their own little front door, and it's kind of trying to get. But having said that, within the main building there is more conventional hostel accommodation for people with higher support needs. But people who out here who can manage a little bit more independent living live in these little cottages. This is another hostel that we did, and I'm showing it because it shows the kind of garden being worked on. But it was absolutely wonderful to go there. Daisy and I went back there. We helped supply plants. We took them down to the local market and bought plants with them. And they had a weekly supper club which we went to, and to go down and help them plant this garden up. It was amazing because people who had been sitting in their rooms with the curtains shut, freaking out, maybe kind of people with serious mental health problems, were coming out and sort of, blinking in the daylight and being encouraged to get involved, not just by the staff, but by their hostel mates, and the sense of sort of brother and sisterhood between people living in there was really incredible to observe. So that's one of those little houses. They're absolutely miniature. You could virtually touch the party walls, as it were, on either side. That's a little kitchenette, little dining table. Under there's a shower room, and you go up steps to sleep on the top. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides. How are we doing? We're doing all right. Can I show you a couple of slides of projects we're working on at the moment? And then I'm going to show you a couple of slides of some things from my sketchbook, because as I said, well, we'll get to that. So this is bigger again, and it's a bit like that ziggurat building that I showed you earlier on. It's a fairly large apartment building, but again, real care taken with the edge of the street and points of entry at regular intervals along the street, so it doesn't just become a sort of dead kind of frontage. It's a building that's in a very suburban location. These are local houses, but the main road is a very main road into London, and so the idea of a very kind of civic kind of frontage to the road felt important and appropriate. But the building stepped down quite rapidly to meet the scale of the surrounding streets. This is a project we're doing in the north of England. It's an existing, very beautiful Grade 1 listed factory from the 17th century, and we're building and it has this amazing sawtooth roof, and so we've decided to try to replicate that in the form of the buildings. So again, street-based housing and a little kind of residential village surrounding the existing building. That's another one we're working on at the moment. We're looking at the possibility of using stone. Most of our projects are brick, but we're working on the island of Guernsey, which is a channel island in the channel between us and France, and there is no clay on that island, so brick has never been a kind of part of their vernacular, but the island is made out of stone. So we're looking now to see where we can afford to do a sort of rubble work. Quite sort of modern, contemporary. Forms, bold forms, but in a kind of a very rustic kind of material, which I think is kind of an interesting combination. This is a little apartment building we're doing in South London. Again, it's social housing next to a park. This is a project that we may or may not do. Hopefully it'll go ahead in Germany, and it's using, again, timber shingles like the one I did before, that I showed you before. And it faces onto a park, and there's an improbably large butterfly there. So let's hope that goes away. So this is the final bit, and I think we don't dream enough. It's very easy in an architect's office to get sort of drawn into pragmatic issues and accepting the status quo, the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think for me, teaching a day a week at the University of Westminster is an opportunity for me to step outside of the crazy world that we inhabit in the here and now, and to get into academia where people are talking sense and trying to think logically about the problem that we face. Academia, by the way, is often characterized as the opposite of that, but I don't agree with that. The madness that I have to face day in, day out, the idea of 150,000 people, 170,000 homeless people in London, that's madness. So to dream a little, to imagine a different world where the sort of the neoliberal project is kind of a thing of the past, is part of what I do for my sanity. And so I did a project called 1 Year, 365 Cities. And the idea was to try and design a city a day for a year. And I failed. But I gave it a good go, and I'm kind of halfway there with it. So these are a series of sketches from my sketchbook, which is and they're kind of mud cities, and there are cities made out of mushroom bricks, and there are cities made out of timber. And there are ones that are hunkered down in the valley, and there are other ones up on stilts. And I just think to sort of cut loose in this way is a very helpful thing to be able to do. And so that's what these are. And I think what goes with this is, for students in particular, is the idea of sketching. And I don't think you can be an architect if you can't sketch. What do you think? Well, I mean, I've worked in offices, and there are architects who can sketch, and they can do their job, and they say to their colleague, I think it should be like this. And there are others who just, yeah, okay. And, you know, very often it's, well, I think it should be like this, and that doesn't tell you anything. So I think to be able to draw is a really, really important part of it, and, you know, slightly unfashionable thing to say, but I really believe it, and it's very evident to me in practice. So that's what that's about. So anyway, so I was inspired to do this to some extent by Lewis Mumford, who in the culture of cities, in an age where architects were much more happy to dream and be propositional and to kind of be heroic in their intention, he said this, instead, and he could be describing the world in which we live now, instead of clinging to the funeral towers of metropolitan finance, ours to march out to newly ploughed fields, to create fresh patterns of political action, to alter for human purpose the perverse mechanisms of our economic regime, to conceive and to germinate fresh forms of human culture. We must erect a cult of life, life in action as the farmer and mechanic know it, life in expression as the artist knows it, life as the lover feels it and the parent practices it, life as it is known to men of goodwill who meditate in the cloister, experiment in the laboratory, or plan intelligently in the factory. So to think beyond you know, the form of our buildings to the culture which we want for ourselves and, you know, for our neighbours and for our kids. So that's what these projects are trying to do. They're trying to think, what could we achieve if we weren't working within the current constraints presented to us day after day in practice and in our everyday lives. This is a little village cooperative in the west of England made out of earth, and earth was a traditional material in our country, and there's still many mud buildings which exist there. This is the last of the projects, and this one is called 100 Mile City. And this again is a dream project, and it works with the idea of that the circumference of London is 100 miles long, if you know, go right round. And the idea that if we have a housing shortage, might this be the place, without sprawl, within a very concentrated ribbon around our city, to create a new city, not a suburban one, but one of buildings of substantial scale with little narrow streets. Here's the countryside, here's suburban London, and this is a ribbon of stuff which wraps right around our city. There's the plan of London with it going round. Again, the farmland beyond, but also very low density suburbia, and our 100-mile city wrapping around London. And this started off actually, incidentally, as one of my 1 year, 365 projects, which we're only supposed to spend 10 minutes on. And I got a bit carried away, so we made this enormous model out of plaster. And every now and then one captures my imagination, we go to work on it. So I wrote this about 100 Mile City. Build a street-based linear city 100 miles long, 100 meters wide and 4 stories high, wrap it round London. Give it little factories, schools, houses and shops, so it's not just a housing scheme. Give it little factories, schools, houses and shops laid out in terraces, along intimately scaled streets and around squares. Make it a dense, intense edge to London, a confident, purposeful boundary fronting a revitalized, productive countryside. 100 Mile City is a linear Barceloneta, a circular Rome, a stretched Porto, suburbia reprogrammed, hybridized, compressed, catalytic urbanism en fleek. Ride the 100-mile high-speed orbital monorail. So London has a fantastic public transport system, but it's a radial one. It goes from central London out to the suburbs. There's no way of getting around London, or not an easy way, on public transport. So we're introducing a monorail which connects all of those frayed ends of the transport system together and makes it much easier to move around the city. Ride the 100-mile high-speed orbital monorail, souped-up Skyfly Circle Line, the loose ends and frayed edges of the London transport system, its isolated city edge train and bus termini, instantly, meaningfully, usefully connected with circus ride technology, Bexley to Brentford in 40 minutes, super functional, super fast, and super fun. And in time, watch our city grow inwards, spreading like a wildfire. So rather than it sprawling outwards, it sprawls inwards and replaces very, very low density suburbia. In time, watch our city grow inwards, spreading like a wildfire through wasteful, antisocial, car-choked suburbia. Eastwards from Richmond, west across the Newham marshes, up from Eltham, across the hills of Greenwich and the empty green swards and golf courses of Enfield. Metroland consolidated, backfilled, integrated and urbanised. London for 40 million people, a kind of inside-out plan voisin, Ville radieuse, Blighty style. So there's a little livestock market and kind of various urban blocks finding form. A view from the outside looking back towards the city. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's
Peter, thank you. I feel a bit like you deserve several sips of water after that.
or maybe a beer
Maybe a beer.
at some point.
Thank you so much. I can't imagine a better lecture for the moment, also in self-interest, as you saw upstairs.
Yeah.
The 70-plus Core 4 architecture students who are trying to work on low-rise, high-density projects that are dealing with all of these issues that you bring up. But I can't help to think that you are uniquely suited in this sort of visionary Monty Python way that only a Brit can do. Reminded that, that some of exactly what you're speaking about and the kinds of architectures and morphologies that you're championing had been a little bit of an illusion in the last, let's say, 60 years. So I do selfishly want to just ask you a few questions before we turn it over to hopefully students in the audience. But one in particular is thinking about another Brit, or Austrian-born Brit, who I can't help but think about, Christopher Alexander, and thinking about pattern language. And something that Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk said at the Vincent Scully Award that Christopher Alexander was winning, right? She said essentially that the most sustainable buildings, right, are ones that are going to be permanent. So I can't help but think about new urbanism, this sort of pre-modern British typology, and then of course your Walter Benjamin quote about the sort of theater of improvisation. And this is just a roundabout way of saying, is there something that we got wrong, or is there some new thing that you are putting on the table between durability and improvisation that I think you are not shy about in terms of your forms?
Well, I think the work does hark back to a sort of pre-modern kind of approach to the city. I mean, I'm a huge kind of Corbusier fan, but when it came to the city, I think he wasn't very smart, and so to that extent, it's quite conservative, our work, and I think there's also a conservatism in the housing typologies that we are using. The terrace house, the back-to-back house, the mansion block. They're all kind of types which have been sort of cherry-picked out of an earlier era, really. One of the things about durability, we were talking to somebody in the studio earlier or something, and they were talking about, we were talking about how much contemporary housing looks very lightweight, and there's a lot of glass and steel and all this sort of stuff. And I was very inspired by the work of people like Alvaro Caesar and people like that whose work feels very, and it's strange because I also came from kind of Richard Rogers' world where it's how light could a building be, and I got really into the possibility of architecture having real permanence and solidity and mass and feeling like it's really anchored to the ground. And so I think, and they give those brick buildings or those rendered buildings give a real sense of kind of durability and resilience.
No, I mean, I think I'm also just thinking about the budget for potted plants and the pots that are so striking in all of your images. So just if I could tease out, do you think that certain of the projects and maybe even in their sort of material rendering invite more of the sort of stoop improvisation, et cetera, if I were to press you on it?
I think it's really hard to predict. I think you kind of learn what works, what is more likely to work. And so for me, a courtyard is a really, you're doing lots of courtyards in your studio, and I think the idea of people having a sort of shared space, which they can have a space outside of their home, which they can start to take control of, and it becomes something really sort of special. It's really hard to know. Sometimes you go back and you've made a space for a flower bed outside somebody's house and it's just full of crisp packets and Coke cans and things like that. So I didn't show any of those, by the way. But I
mean, I sense if someone in the room is willing to do a dissertation on the kind of post-occupancy, plant tallying, I think it's a very, very worthy one to do.
Yeah, I mean, people do that. I mean, and quite often there'll be lots of forms and things earnestly filled out. I'd rather just go back with the camera and be just try and work out what's going on and maybe talk to people. I mean, another thing I was going to think of doing was to get some disposable cameras and give them, because we take the picture we want to take, don't we? But if you gave people, residents, a camera and then said, look, can I come back in a week and collect it? That'd be quite a nice way of doing a sort of quite a interesting post-occupancy kind of.
And maybe my one last question actually is about then the repetition and scalability of your work, is something that's so striking, is how many examples and permutations of this very distinct morphology you have. But one of the Core 4 students, prompted from some material I sent them, including my favorite news segment, Have I Got Mews for You? I love it. This question is, could you imagine being able to quantify the sociability of a building type in a metric that we could point to or name in the same way that density perhaps is valued?
Crikey. I think it's really hard to quantify things like that, and the reason why people often people like to put a quantity on things, don't they? Whether
Herbert.
Whether it's sort of you get all of these consultants, daylight, sunlight consultant. Is it enough light? Is it 20 meters from one building to the next? Is the street wide enough to get a fire engine? These are things which are really easy to measure, and and people are really keen to kind of do that. It's really hard to sort of quantify the kind of social benefits of a project. It really, really is, and I think that's why it's the thing that often gets forgotten about, actually. So I don't really know what the short answer to that is, except I suppose I think photographs are really helpful, because you can sort of see whether something's working or not working. Yeah.
And obviously the kind of conversion of hearts and minds in design schools is one way to do it bottom up.
Yeah, definitely. Really worthwhile.
And maybe in that interest, actually, we could now turn it over with the mic runners.
Can I just say how brilliant it was to see your students' work? It was really fantastic. Because I went around the studio with Jenny this afternoon, and it was really good to see. Wonderful. And I went around talking to them, and they were explaining their projects in a fantastic way.
Sarah, we owe Peter some fees for desk crits. No, thank you for saying that, and it was really a pleasure to have your eyeballs on models and things. Not enough hand sketching is my,
No, lovely to see models, though.
Okay, do we have some questions from the audience? And might I, from whatever discernment the mic runners can give, to say, make sure we get some students as well?
The last talk I did, there was only one mic runner, and he was just, by the end of the show, he was completely exhausted. Anyway, you've got it better sorted out than that.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciated your 3 ideas on what you think is needed to address the housing crisis. I often feel uncertain or curious about the role of social housing in maintaining or sustaining this perpetual crisis in housing. And I also was just really admired your thought on a city that invites occupation and a city that might also untangle what we see or label as invasion, which I think is needed a lot right now. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more on your theory of change on how social housing can push against the perpetual crisis of housing.
Well, I mean, to some extent it's about money, isn't it? Well, I mean, I don't know how it is here, but in England, they're not spending enough money on it, and we're a wealthy country, and it's a question of priorities, really. And so that's what needs to happen. And even though we've got a sort of notionally a Labour or left-wing government, they're not committing the funding to it, and I think that's what needs to happen. I was talking to somebody today who was saying that as the housing crisis starts to hit the middle classes, and it sort of creeps up through the kind of social strata, it's becoming a bigger issue, a political issue, and the hope is that, as I say, we live in a democracy. It's up to us what type of society we want, what our priorities are, and if getting this situation sorted out is a big enough priority, then I think we can do it. I think what form that takes is interesting. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s in the UK, the social housing is an extraordinary achievement. It was quite top-down, and I think it'd be really interesting to think how a new social housing program might be a more sort of bottom-up, enabling process. There are obviously sort of cooperatives and community land trusts and things like that, which I think have to be probably a better model than mass housing just sort of dropped in from above.
Maybe in the back and then in the front.
Hi, over here.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Oh, was this one? So, okay. Thank you so much. This was incredibly joyful to see. It strikes me how much there's a sense of dignity that's afforded in the way that you create these spaces, in a way that I think social housing, you're resisting the kind of, like as you describe it, the vertical kind of shapeless kind of bland housing that often becomes vertical slums in their own right. And I'm curious to you I'd love to hear what frictions you face when you present these ideas to, say, a city council or to people like that, and how you navigate those conversations and how you frame it in a way that really makes sense to them.
Yeah. Well, it's extraordinary, really, because I don't know how it is here, but certainly in the UK, so when somebody hears there's a development going to happen, they're worried about, that's going to happen. And when you say, well, actually, we're going to get the same number of homes by turning that thing on its side, and we're going to run a street through the middle of it, so you didn't used to be able to get from there to there, you used to have to do that. We're going to allow you to walk through, and these are actually houses rather than big blocks of flats. It's a really good news story, and it doesn't take a lot of persuading to do. I think people breathe a sort of sigh of relief that it's street-based housing, that it has a kind of public component, and that it's kind of public-spirited in the way that it connects with local neighbourhoods, local streets. We're not putting a fence around a site and putting a big building in the middle. It's part of the city, and I think that's a really powerful, compelling, attractive argument, really.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
One of the things I love about your designs is the way it seems you've been able to remove cars from your designs. And that's something I think a lot of us struggle with in the US, and I think throughout the world. But I just would like you to speak specifically about how, whether it's working with the zoning or the governments, and how do you overcome the dominance of the automobile?
Well, in London, we're doing work around the country increasingly, but in London we have a fantastic public transport system. And have you been to London? Yeah. So it's not brilliant to drive around. It takes a long time to get anywhere. So go by tube, you know. So we're really lucky, and I'm not saying that's a solution that's sort of transferable to everywhere. London's a very walkable city for the most part. You know, there are corner shops, there are schools pretty close by everywhere. People could get to work on the metro, on the tube train. Some of our projects do have housing. In fact, the one by the North Circular, by the motorway, actually hidden under there there's a change in level which enabled us to have a little car park for about half the homes there. It doesn't get used very much actually, because people, as I say, use the tube, but it was a requirement of the planning department that we provided car parking spaces. Where we do have a requirement for car parking, our approach is usually that it should be on street, so pavement edge, you know. And I think the logic to that is, although your street ends up with lots of cars in it, it's part of the coming and going of the street, people cleaning their cars, people going to and from their cars. Because another model in our country is that the cars are parked in the middle of the urban block. And what happens with that is people walk into the backs of their houses and they don't use the street at the front, which I think is negative. So, and I think probably with street edge parking, we can get to 70% parking, which probably here you'd be looking for more than that. But in more suburban locations, that's usually considered to be, so if you've got 100 homes, you have 70 parking spaces. And I don't know how it works here. I mean, yeah. I mean, I was walking down through all those balloon frame houses down through, which are alongside Massachusetts Avenue on the way down to the river yesterday. And it was people parking on the streets or on their forecourts and things like that seemed to work all right. And that would be my approach, really. I mean, you know, Jane Jacobs said that the motor car, I mean, she's in New York, so again, great public transport. She said it's the biggest threat to urban civilization, urban, you know, culture. She said, people, you know, she was writing in the 60s, so she said, people think that television is killing the relationship between people. People think that hard drugs is killing the relationship people. Her view was that the motor car was the biggest threat to urban culture. And I think she's got a point to some extent.
This is now working. Thank you so much for being here. I was born alarmingly close to the North Circular, so last place on Earth I would expect to see that writ large on the screen in front of me. My question is about how you navigate the politics of the landscape in which you're designing. You know, as you've pointed out, social housing in the UK has such a specific loaded history, and I noticed that you work across both social and private sectors. You know, you design buildings which are entirely aimed towards social housing, which are entirely private, and which are a mix. Does your design approach change because of that as you approach each project? Do you believe that everything should be approached in the same manner? And related to that, how do you find yourself like rubbing up against the financial situation? Like you said, despite the fact that we have a Labour government now, they're not committing any significant amount of money towards increasing social housing. Are there any examples of projects, like dream projects, where you were rubbing up against that politics and you had to adapt or innovate in order to get what you wanted to get done?
Right, what was the first part again? She can't remember.
Does your approach at all change?
Mixing,
yes.
Yeah. So, no, there's no difference. Housing design in our country is governed by quite strict design standards. So the size of a flat, the size of a bedroom, the size of a living room, and public housing providers and private housing providers, unless it's very, very high end, don't want to exceed what. So the rooms will be the same size. Very often in housing, you have, if it's in a lot of people's projects, you have a social housing block and a private housing block. And the private house, the social housing block is sort of hidden around the back a little bit, and the door will be around the back. So in our stuff, it's a street. It's a street, so you can have a row of private houses, front doors, and then and a row of for sale ones, and a row of and they can be sort of pepper potted around the development. And when you have an apartment building which has got some social and some private in it, it creates a difficulty about maintenance costs and ongoing maintenance. Whereas if you have a street-based terraced housing, they can all be managed kind of separately, and so it makes it much easier to do. And the second part of the question.
Financing.
Finance.
Yes, and how that rubs up against your practice. So if there's, especially in social housing.
Well, it's the same for every sort of architect. You have to make it work. As I said in the course of the presentation, by having projects which have virtually no common area circulation, we're already creating a massive plus for the developer. He's not having to build those corridors and all that, lifts. And so although some of the architectural detail is elaborate, it's more than cancelled out by the fact that we're not building a building that's 25% bigger than it needs to be. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Maybe we have one more question. I think, Sarah, looks like someone up at the back.
Hey, Peter, thank you for coming to Cambridge. Welcome back. Really enjoyed your presentation and thought those were some beautiful sketches. And Jen, thank you for using the word new urbanism here. I don't know if I've heard that in a long time. So my question is, I come from a development background, and we're always intrigued at building high density in a low density format to really drive down the cost. And I noticed a lot of the projects that you showed were 1 to 3 stories, 4 stories, and it seemed like it really was built for 2 purposes. One is to provide outdoor space to a lot of the residents, to foster a community, and give some of those folks a feeling of independence. And 2, maybe to drive down costs. And we find that works really well in markets where land is not too expensive, and in certain markets you have to go more than 3 or 4 stories, Manhattan, parts of Boston now. And I'm curious, have you seen any good examples of how you can foster this type of community in a higher density format? We were going 10, 12 stories above. The tallest built project we've got there is 7 stories. But one of the ones I showed, I don't know if you remember, was like a 10, 11-story block. And I said the things that were important to me, how the building related to the street, remained important, even if we're building taller buildings. And so this I don't know if it's a word that you use, a mansion block, but the Victorians built very tall and very dense apartment buildings, which were still very street-based. The height doesn't, clearly, if you're going to the extent of very high rise, it does, but height doesn't necessarily equate to density. And a project which is very efficient in the way it covers the ground can, at 5, 6 stories, create a density which is equal to your 10-story block, which sits in the middle of a site using land quite inefficiently. You think of Paris, central Paris, where buildings are 6, 8, 10 stories, incredibly dense city, and there are also areas of London. So I think it'd be really good to sort of interrogate this, whatever metric you choose to use in terms of measuring density. I'm not pretending else. And of course, the other thing is that it's horses for courses. So the projects you've seen, some of them are in incredibly suburban locations. As you say, the single-story project is virtually in other people's back gardens. We wouldn't have had permission to build higher than that. Elsewhere, 3, 4 stories, it feels about right. Most of the houses around are about 2 and 3, so we take it to 3 and 4. And in other locations, typically we're building higher than what the adjacent properties are. And we have quite a strict sort of planning system, which kind of tries to make things contextual. So it's rarely a question of just, you know, chucking a tall building around in a neighborhood of lower buildings. So typically our projects are quite a lot denser than their surroundings. And that's, you know, why they're quite popular with our private developer clients, because we'll sometimes go into the planning meeting, you know, to meet the planning department, the council planning department. They say, well, it ought to be a 5-story building, but because it's you, we'll let you do 6. We know you'll do it nicely. And
so to answer that earlier question, seemingly you've erased the frictions because you've embedded in the logic of what you're going to propose, and now people know it, right? And
well, I think it is easier now, but I think to try to do architecture well, you have to be able. It has to work for everybody. It has to work for the people who live next door. It has to work for the developer. The planning department needs to feel comfortable. You have to carry everybody along. And again, with the conversation with somebody earlier on, was it's such a big part of being an architect is communication. You know, either through drawing, either through models, or being able to talk, you know, with conviction about what you're trying to do. And but also to design something which takes into account, so didn't talk about it that much, but where our buildings, which are often pushed quite far to the perimeter of the site, how they address the relationship between the back of our project and the gardens of people next door, how it steps down in subtle ways. And I think, you know, again, that's why it's nice to see models in your studio. The only way of really knowing about those sorts of relationships is with physical models, not computer models, physical models.
well, I was going to say that was the perfect end, but then you also complimented me, so it's a doubly perfect end. Thank you so much, Peter. We are so lucky to have you here tonight.
Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you. Oh.